In this talk entitled "You're Not Just an Eyeball, the Role of Religious Faith in Healing of Vision Loss," I would like to explore the interaction between religious belief and spirituality and healing and the interests of medicine. As medicine has increased in complexity and become much more technical in nature, there's been an increasing subspecialization. Care is delivered by protocols. Organisation of clinics separates people with diseases of the eyeball or the heart or the liver, etc. And this has resulted in a culture of atomization, increasing subspecialization, and fed a more reductionistic outlook. Of course, staff are drawn to healthcare by the desire to care for people, yet many find this culture of medicine not conducive to the kind of care that they would like to deliver. Could this be contributing to rising rates of burnout amongst Western medics? Western medical culture is a largely secular space, emphasizing the culture and epistemology of medical science. This is the objective and empirical study and application of biomedical facts. Yet medicine deals with people in their subjective and storied existence. And when people suffer illness, they ask questions. Why me? What have I done to deserve this? What is my life for? Will I die? What happens after that? These questions are spiritual in nature in a broadest sense of the term. I've just finished studying a master's degree in theology, spirituality and health. I've looked at how religious and spiritual beliefs interact with medical science. There are over 27,000 research papers in medical journals on how religion and health interact, the majority showing a benefit, although certainly not exclusively so. Causes and treatment of disease, it seems, form a complex web rather than linear causal chains. And so the big question is, does attention to this side of human nature impact disease rates and recovery? We're used in medical presentations to disclosures, usually financial, but in a talk like this, a different kind of disclosure is needed. I trained as a physician and then an ophthalmologist, and I'm a practicing Christian. I've also trained in recent years in theology and church ministry in a free church setting, and I've already mentioned the master's degree in theology, spirituality and health. In his book published in the 1980s, The View from Nowhere, philosopher Thomas Nagel at New York University contrasts two types of perspective. There is the personal and subjective perspective and the detached and objective one. When we seek to understand the world, we hold the two in tension. Today, an attempt at an objective consideration of the effect of religious faith on health is what I'm looking to achieve. But these themes raise questions that are personal and subjective, and I would say that it is not possible to have an entirely detached and disinterested view. So it is important that any of us acknowledge our understanding of the world, our own presuppositions, and how we access such a thing as truth. This knowledge is always embodied. It's always bound up with culture and experience and assumptions, and we know this in medicine and therefore give disclosures. In this talk, which is really concerned with a whole person approach in healthcare, I'd like to ask some questions. How did we get here to our current view of the person who is sick and how we deal with them? I'll then present a case of visual loss, and after that I would like to explore some interdisciplinary reflections in an attempt to demonstrate how medical science and disciplines such as psychology might dialogue with theology and spirituality. The final question is there a role for spirituality in healthcare and how this should be pursued? In his book Religion and Science, Ian Barber demonstrates 4 ways in which the realms of religion and science have interacted in history. The first way is the conflict model, which we all have been aware of and seen in conversations, both on the internet and in person. This is where there is a fundamental belief that the viewpoint of religion and science are irreconcilable, and therefore when the two come into one another's company, conflict is inevitable. Secondly, he suggests an independence approach, which suggests that the two are so different that they cannot helpfully interact. Thirdly, however, he explores the possibility of dialogue, that these are 2 perspectives on one situation and are different forms of knowledge and means of getting to the truth. Finally, he suggests an integration model where the two merge into a unified or certainly much more closely cooperative view of knowledge and truth. This picture shows a fresco in a church in Siena called the Ospedale di Santa Maria della Scala. It's entitled Care of the Sick, was painted by Domenico di Bartolo and depicts, this is in the 15th century, it depicts a wounded pilgrim in the foreground being attended to by a number of different people. There are nurses here, there's a surgeon, there are people bringing clothes and food, and there's a priest listening to religious concerns and taking confession. As a model of care, it illustrates in the 15th century in Italy how a whole person was approached. This was not simply a biological wound, but was set in a psychological, social and spiritual context. Could this be an early depiction of the biopsychosocial spiritual model of disease, we might ask? I'm not sure that the people giving care in this fresco would have conceived of the person in those separate categories, but that over time, as our disciplines have emerged since the Enlightenment, different ways of viewing the world and the person, that the different realms have been put together in a Lego kind of model of whole person care. This statue is found on Trinity Street in Cambridge and is of William Harvey. He gave the first description of the dual blood circulation in humans in the late 16th century, working hard in the anatomy dissection room in Padua University in Italy to describe the anatomy. He described his work, his observational study, as truly arduous, and said he was tempted to think that the movement of the heart was only to be comprehended by God. As he described the heart and its action as a pump, this was perhaps the start of a change in the view of the role of organs in the body, such that the heart was no longer the seat of the soul with its passions and desires, but had a purely mechanical function. It's possible, therefore, that this line of thinking, which grew over subsequent centuries, traced a change in the way people were seen and the function of the parts of their body. Around the same time, Francis Bacon was constructing what came to be known as the scientific method, arguing that such knowledge could be gleaned only from careful empirical observation using the senses. Knowledge, therefore, he said, is based on experience and is probabilistic, always subject to further testing and revision of hypotheses. Crucially, he believed that the two books of God, the natural world and the Bible, could not be read together in a unified hermeneutic, since intuition, revelation, and a priori reasoning were not subject to empiricism and falsification. Undoubtedly, the rise of biomedicine brought many successes. Think of Jenner, or Ridley, or Fleming. Yet the laws of nature applied in physiology and pharmacology and pathology, as they described the processes happening in both in health and disease, the concept of life supported by religious belief and by God at work in our world receded, and deism was born. Immanuel Kant later argued that only phenomena can be known and that teleology can't be found in the physical world. Science cannot tell us what life is for. It can only say how it functions. Since the organic world, therefore, cannot be understood without a teleological perspective, he reasoned that we'll never have a Newton of the blade of grass. This was a pessimistic view of life science, and it would drive an increasingly reductionistic and deterministic and materialistic approach to medical science. Corresponding with this theory of disease, the medical profession was undergoing a progressive secularization, and the enduring metaphor that emerged was of the physician as a scientist. In his book, his book entitled The Anticipatory Corpse, philosopher and physician Geoffrey Bishop explores the epistemology of medicine. Where does it get its knowledge? Reflecting back to the early anatomy theatres in Europe, his thesis is that the dead body has become the normative source of knowledge in medicine, which dissects dead and decaying specimens to gain knowledge of the living body. Through suppressing the perspective of final causation or ultimate purpose in health and illness, and embracing a more immediate causality, in other words, a metaphysics of efficient causation, he suggests, quote, medicine has become thoughtless. Medicine is primarily about pragmatic doing and efficient control. It is ordered to utilitarian maximization and its own practicality. Medicine embraced the metaphysics of modern natural sciences. Thus, with the rise of modern medicine, death is pulled out of communal contexts with various mythological, narrative and liturgical meanings in order to become the ground of medical knowledge. End of quote. This rather morbid diagnosis of medicine's culture and practice is that there is something rotten at the heart of medicine, and this raises a very important question. Can we really exclude purpose and greater meaning in life from medical causation and medical consideration? Is medicine about function only, or is it also about purpose in both health and disease? This talk is primarily illustrative of some of the themes I'm trying to explore, but of course the evidence that medical inquiry has generated is fundamental and important to the discussion. This paper, entitled The Association of Religious Service Attendants with Mortality Among Women, was published in JAMA in 2016. It followed 75,000 female participants participating in the nurses' health study. There was a 20-year follow-up period, and they compared those who attended religious services at least weekly with those who had never done so. And they found that in the group with frequent attendance, there was a 33% lower all-cause mortality rate. This was even after adjusting for several different lifestyle factors, and they suggested various explanatory variables that mediated the effects, such as social support, reduced smoking rates, reduced depressive symptoms, and greater levels of optimism. These factors explained around half of the effect, so there is clearly something else going on as well. This study, published in Psychosomatic Medicine in 1996, was a prospective study of several hundred middle-aged Finnish men matched for a series of risk factors. At the beginning of the study, none of the men had cardiovascular problems or malignant disease. They all completed a simple questionnaire measuring their level of hopelessness. This was expressed as their level of expected control over their futures. At the end of 6 years, participants with high expressed levels of hopelessness had nearly 4 times the risk of a new myocardial infarction and over twice the risk of developing a new malignancy. What this evidence shows is that the spiritual problem of hopelessness, quite apart from its profound effects on the quality of life, is an important risk factor for cardiovascular and neoplastic disease. Several questions are raised by this. Is there such a thing as a spiritual disease? Is there such a thing as spiritual pathology or disorders of spiritual structure and function? There are no agreed answers to these questions, but some ideas are explored in other material. Recognizing the need for a new medical model beyond the biomedical one, this important paper by George Engel, a psychiatrist, was published in Science in 1977. He described what he called the biopsychosocial model of disease, that considerations from each of those realms and disciplines were important in understanding the generation of disease and its treatment. This was a step towards a more whole person approach, understanding people with disease in their various contexts and storied existence. The question of this presentation is whether it is sufficient, or whether spiritual and religious concerns and practices should also be part of medicine's consideration. I turn now to a case of a patient that I treated in a hospital a few years ago. This patient presented with blurred vision that would have had the effect seen in the picture, and it's a case where the patient's own religious faith helped bring healing where medical treatments, which had been numerous, had not. The patient was an Asian male in his early 30s who was in a successful role as a lawyer, leading a large team of lawyers in the public sector. The cause of his blurred vision was a diagnosis called central serous retinopathy, where a leaking of fluid under the retina causes loss of retinal function and therefore blurring of the vision. It is usually self-limiting and will clear up by itself if the underlying cause, which is usually stress-related, is addressed. Taking a whole person approach in this case of CSR, we should consider biological, psychological, social and spiritual dimensions. From a biological perspective, stress at work, which the patient identified as his main problem, had caused him to eat more than he needed. He'd put on a lot of weight. He'd developed high blood pressure, was a borderline diabetic, and he was receiving treatment for these things. Psychologically, his high stress levels had caused him a great deal of anxiety, and he had sought help for these, spending quite a lot of money on counselling. He cited high demands from his boss, who was very controlling, as a significant factor in work stress, as well as a high workload over which he felt he had little control. But he also had high expectations of himself in achieving a successful career, which was well paid and which had all the attendant signs of success. He lived in a large rented house with a partner, because sadly his marriage had dissolved 2 or 3 years previously, and so clearly there were social ramifications of his stress levels as well. He was living in a different city from the one he grew up with, and which he had left at the age of 18 to go to university. But I was also interested in his spiritual well-being, and I asked him if he had a faith that helps when things are difficult. I've often found this to be a helpful question, since it is relatively open-ended, and the patient is free to decline to continue the conversation in that direction. I have never had anyone become upset at being asked, and sometimes a person will say it's not part of their life, but many times people will reflect on some of the more bigger themes in life that give life meaning and purpose from a spiritual perspective, and how those have either been transgressed in their situation and disease, or how they've been helpful. So it seemed clear that work stress, both from the patient's perspective and from a medical one, with its effects on his biological, psychological and social well-being, was a key part of the cause of his disease. I would like to try to demonstrate how the social sciences and medical perspectives on work stress and more drivenness to work, such as workaholism, could interact with theological and spiritual themes in this patient's case. He explained that he was a Christian, and that this had been quite a significant part of his life growing up until he left home. He'd been quite involved in Sunday school and other church activities, and our conversation was a significant part of him finding a way forward in life, as he reflected on how his early years and formative thinking in his Christian faith, which he'd fallen away from for a period, could actually be useful in finding healing. There are different models of work stress, but a well-known one is the transactional model. There is the stimulus to stress in the environment, but also the response in the person to that stimulus. And it is the transaction between the two that produce the work stress. So running a nuclear power station and preventing serious accident would be a very responsible and potentially stressful job. But with the personality of someone like Homer Simpson attempting to perform that role, the potential for work stress is quite high. One of the most common research tools to have been used in studies of workaholism was a battery produced by Spence and Robbins, a questionnaire which essentially had two elements. On the one hand, it examined the positive associations of work, such as work satisfaction and a sense of psychological well-being. This reflects the increased satisfaction in work that comes through increased industry and application, in the sense that often the more we put into the work we're doing, the more rewarding the work becomes. On the other hand, however, there are negative associations with levels of work that have become unhealthy. These can reflect a poor work-life balance, where work becomes predominant in someone's life, to the exclusion of other positive aspects in life, such as good friendships, a healthy home life, exercise, dietary habits and hobbies. In its more extreme forms, this can become an addiction, where high levels of conscientiousness and industry in work have led to addictive proportions, where work predominates in someone's thinking, such that there's little in life apart from the work and the career or job that they're pursuing. We look to things in life for affirmation, for a sense of identity, and in a sense, work can become addictive when our affirmation and identity is received from our work to an unhealthy degree. This can produce significant psychological distress. Of course, different personalities interact with different work scenarios. There has been a small amount of work on the interaction in the literature between personality and workaholism. McAdams' 3 levels of description of personality are worth reviewing here. He described the dispositional traits, and the so-called Big Five are those that have most descriptive power of the variety of personality traits that each of us carry. They are extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness. Extroversion and conscientiousness and openness are all associated with a positive experience of work, whereas neuroticism and agreeableness tend to be associated with a negative experience of work. These neuroticism, of course, is a predominantly negative emotion and can lead to an unhealthy attitude to work, where we're often questioning our value in the workplace and how others see us, and this leads us to stress in the workplace and to perhaps unhealthy levels of output in work to try to make up for a perceived deficiency. Agreeableness can also lead to stress, because the agreeable person is seeking to show compassion and to try to appease perceived expectations of others, which can lead someone to work too hard. Goals and motivations are a second level in personality description, which also need to be considered. These can be divided into intrinsic motivations and extrinsic ones. Intrinsic goals in our life are those things that we are pursuing that are inherently or intrinsically of value to us. They reflect the values that we hold personally, and so we pursue the goal for its own ends. In the sense of work, this can be doing a job which is of intrinsic value to us. The role itself fulfills to a large degree the values that we hold and the things that we think are important. Extrinsic goals, on the other hand, are where we are pursuing one thing in order to achieve a secondary outcome. In the context of work, this might be the salary, or it might be a sense of status according to the expectations of others or around us or the culture, but not according to values that we intrinsically hold for ourselves. So extrinsic goals can lead to stress because we find ourselves in a role that is not of intrinsic value to us, that we have to fulfill in order to achieve secondary goals. Thirdly, there's the overall sense of our life story. Meaning making is incredibly important to human well-being, and the sense of life direction, that life is going somewhere and that it is of great meaning and value, is a large part of human thought and behavior. Work cannot be understood apart from this, from life story, or indeed the three levels of personality description together. Of course, our personality will therefore affect our attitude and our approach to work, but there is also evidence to show that a negative experience of work and workaholism can modify our personality. We may have recognized this in ourselves when we're stressed at work, that our natural characteristics are modified under pressure, or we might see that in others. In his book Habits of the Heart, Robert Bellah, the American sociologist, coins the phrase of expressive individualism. Modern secular culture is different from nearly every other culture in the world and in history, which says that you find who you are by connecting to something more important than you. Modern secular culture, by contrast, says that you find your identity by looking within yourself and then expressing that individually in the culture and society in which you live. Talking to my patient, the experiences and thought processes that he described made me think of Robert Bellah's term, since his desire to succeed, for that to be through career and through a profession, and to earn a significant wage and live a certain lifestyle, seems to be dominating drivers that kept this patient in the context of a stressful work environment. He would often say how even if his work was very difficult, it had enabled a certain level of lifestyle, and that goal in his life was where he got his sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. The question then is, does theology and spirituality have anything to say in the medical arena when illnesses such as this patient's arise? As I talked to my patient, I described the other half of my working life as that of a church pastor, and as he had become interested in the conversation of how his religious faith might bring a perspective and a helpful way forward in ways that the various medical treatments and counselling to sustain and manage his stress had not, I suggested there was a potential conflict of interest. It's important, I think, to maintain boundaries in the roles, and he was seeing me as a doctor. So I suggested if he wanted to pursue the conversation, that we could do that either in the chapel or that he do it with a local church pastor. He said he would like to continue talking as he found our relationship helpful. And there were two things that we talked about in that conversation. The first was something that Augustine of Hippo wrote in his book Confessions. Augustine led a significant life and quite a privileged one. He was born in a family of decent means, had a good education, and lived a hedonistic lifestyle until his 30s, when he had a conversion experience and became a Christian. As he looked back on the years of his socializing and womanizing and his various pursuits in academia and politics and public life, he realized that there was a deep satisfaction that his heart was looking for, and he'd looked for that in various ways. He'd looked for meaning and identity and for freedom and a sense of belonging. And when he became a Christian and discovered God's purposes in his life and a relationship with God, he wrote that you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and your heart and our heart is restless until it rests in you. He discovered that life is not primarily about living according to rules or cultural expectations, but is about relationship, and most significantly about relationship with the God who made us, who knows how we're designed and has unique purposes for us that suit the design that he has made. Secondly, we reflected on the cross of Christ and the central message of that to the Christian faith. How might this help my patient? How might it help other patients with a Christian faith? There are two messages that emerged in our conversations of the cross, and there's a need to understand both of them to know how it might help. Firstly, the cross tells us that there's a problem with the human race. The diagnosis, in a sense, is serious because we are alienated from God. This language our culture often finds offensive. It's the language of sin. In McAdam's language, in his description of personality, goals and motivations and the life story of our lives is viewed in Christian theology as centered around ourselves rather than God in our unregenerate state. Our choices, therefore, have moral value. Sin is the language of responsibility and moral accountability, and we are dignified with that responsibility. So the first message in Christian thought is that the diagnosis is serious and such that a solution that would take an event like the cross to fix. Secondly, whilst we are worse than we think we are, we're far more loved than we'd imagine. The message is of divine grace and forgiveness and restoration. So there's an exchange. The old life with its passions and desires that dies in someone who turns to Christ for forgiveness, and a new life in Jesus with new goals and new motivations and a new story. As a paradigm of change, the cross is central in the Christian life. This encouraged my patient to go and to consider how this might illuminate a way forward for him. I saw him 6 months later, and I was struck at the change in this man. His CSR had resolved, but more than that, he looked just so much lighter. His blood pressure had come under control without the need for medication, which had stopped, and just a sense of the sense of well-being was more tangible. He'd lost quite a lot of weight and had joined a walking group, but the biggest change in his life that he decided was necessary was that he had to change his job, and he'd resigned a few weeks after we'd last met and found another job, still in law, but with much less levels of stress. The salary was significantly lower, and he'd sold the expensive sports car parked in the garage, but he seemed so much happier with life, and his relationship with his girlfriend and with other friends who he'd not seen for quite a long time were going much better. Of course, I was delighted to hear that he'd made significant decisions and found a good way forward that seemed to be working for him. Not all stories or not all application of religious faith and belief in illness results in such good outcomes, but there are great resources in religious belief to deal with ongoing suffering and chronic disease. So for discussion then, consider these questions. Is the biomedical or biopsychosocial model sufficient in medicine? Is it a sufficiently large model to explain human thought and behaviour, generation of disease and treatment? What should be the relationship between religion and medicine in clinical practice? We have chaplaincies in hospitals and particularly in palliative care. But if someone is a whole with a spiritual aspect of their being at the end of life, is this not also true throughout life in whatever illnesses we meet? How do different faith traditions understand disease and health, thinking particularly in terms of Eastern versus Western? And what are the barriers in medicine to practicing a whole person approach?